Chapter 9 Change of a Name. The Passionist retreat of Maraval, dedicated to Our Lady of the Oak, had neither the majestic dimensions nor the pleasing architectural lines of the great monastic buildings of the Middle Ages. It was a plain, two-storied structure of the utmost simplicity. A modest belfry rising over the red-tiled roof was almost the only clue to the function of the building. From its vantage point upon a hillside, it looked out upon a broad panorama extending from the mountains to the sea. Standing expectantly upon the doorstep, the three visitors heard the strident echo of the bell as it vibrated in some distant corner of the monastery. Soon the heavy door swung back, and for the first time in his life, Francis Pacenti saw the Passionist's habit. The smiling brother who welcomed them was dressed in a black tunic, with a plain leather belt around his waist. To the left, a white heart surmounted by a white cross enclosed the words, Jesu expiae passio, with 3 nails. A rosary hanging from the girdle and bare sandaled feet completed the picture. Quickly, all three were ushered into the monastery parlor. In this meeting place of the world and the cloister, it was clear that the cloister had prevailed. No concession had been made to comfort. No inducement was offered to the visitor to prolong his visit for 1 minute longer than was necessary. There were no heavy carpets or thick rugs or polished floors, no easy chairs, no occasional tables, no pictures on the walls. The only ornament on the whitewashed walls was a large crucifix. The floor was of plain brick, but clean and well swept. A bare wooden table and a few rush-bottomed chairs comprised all the furniture. Hardly had they taken stock of their surroundings when there was a discreet knock at the door. The priest who entered was Father Raphael of St. Anthony, master of novices, who greeted them cordially at the same time, making a quick inspection of the new postulant. They had barely exchanged a few words when another priest came in, this time a much younger man, Father Norbert of St. Mary. Although Francis could not have guessed it at the time, Father Norbert was destined to play a very important part in his future. He would be his confessor and spiritual guide for his whole religious life, and it would be due in great measure to Father Norbert's prudent direction that he would attain his ultimate sanctity. At this date, Father Norbert was 27 years of age. He had been ordained in December 1851 at the age of 22, and had been vice master of novices for 2 years. Slightly built and below average height, he had a personality that commanded respect without ceasing to attract. His sharp, penetrating eyes and rather severe appearance were relieved by a smile that always lurked about his lips. Although still comparatively young, he possessed a marked degree of spiritual perception, and to personal holiness he joined a wide knowledge of ascetical knowledge. Above all, he insisted upon the importance of intensive cultivation of the interior life as a means of sanctity, and he emphasized this aspect in the training of the novices. A couple of hours passed quickly, but Father Aloysius felt a sudden pang of sadness as he realized that the inevitable parting was drawing near. Tentative plans had already been discussed for Francis to return for another night to the Capuchin friary. Next day, all three would visit St. Augustine's convent, Monte Gregaro, where Sister Mary Teresa Friscotti was eagerly awaiting them. No doubt the good nun was on tiptoe of expectation, for she had never met her nephew Francis, although she had heard plenty about him. And she would see her Capuchin brother and her Dominican nephew as well. She would have a feast of family news. In quotes, "Poor aunt," observed Father Aloysius whimsically. "She was waiting us with open arms, but at one blow the good Lord dashed my hopes and deprived my aunt of the consolation she expected." End quotes. The unexpected blow was delivered by Francis himself. As they rose to go, Father Aloysius told the two Passionists of the plans they had made and expected Francis to leave with them and return the next day. The master of novices approved of the suggestion, but to his astonishment Francis opposed it. He had come a long way to join the Passionists, he said. He had at length arrived at the monastery, and he had no desire to leave it. In vain did his uncle insist and his brother plead. Francis was adamant. Despite his disappointment, Father Aloysius did not press the point and said no more. The time had come for parting, so he tenderly embraced his brother, not indeed without tears being shed. In quotes, "And there and then," he concluded with touching simplicity, "I left him and never saw him again in this life." End quotes. Whilst the Capuchin and the Dominican were retracing their steps down the hill, they could not help wondering how it fared with Francis. But he had no time to feel lonely or depressed, for things began to happen with bewildering rapidity. Father Norbert briskly took charge of him, told him to pick up his bag, and led him to the novices section of the monastery. In quotes, "I took him to the room assigned to him," the priest recalled afterwards, "and introduced him to the novitiate, and from that moment we were never parted. Only death was able to separate us." End quotes. No matter how much he thought he knew about the religious life, Francis must have felt quite lost during the first few days. There was so much to be learned about his new life, so much to be forgotten about the old. Father Norbert gave him a short preliminary talk with a copy of the daily timetable or horarium, but at first it was not easy to know what to do. To help him out, he was given a copy of the novice's regulations and some suitable books for spiritual reading and meditation. For the first time, he learned in detail the inspiring story of the origin of the Passionists. While still a layman, the founder, St. Paul of the Cross, was favored by a series of visions in which the plan for the future congregation was revealed to him. Clothed in the black habit of the Passion, our Blessed Lady appeared to the saint to give him a vital message. You must found a congregation in which the members will be clothed thus, and in which there will be continual mourning for the passion and death of my dear son. Fortified by this heavenly approval, Paul of the Cross had written the rule of the new institution. Although, on account of its austerity, many years elapsed before it was sanctioned by the Holy See, it was finally approved by Pope Clement XIV in 1769 by the bull Supremi Apostolatus. The first monastery was founded on Monte Argentero in 1737, and before the saint's death in Rome in 1775, several other retreats had been established in the Papal States. The retreat of Maravalli had been founded in 1779, 4 years after the death of St. Paul of the Cross. The first rector had been Father Vincent Mary Strambini, later Bishop of Macerata and afterwards canonized. With the arrival of Francis, the novitiate was brought up to its full complement of 13 novices. Amongst them were some who later became notable figures in the congregation. One was already a priest, Father Bernard Mary of Jesus, afterwards Superior General of the Passionists for almost 30 years. Another was Francis Xavier of Our Lady of Sorrows, also in his turn General of the Passionists. Father Bernard Mary was assigned as companion to the new arrival to help him to find his bearings in the first few difficult days. He taught Francis how to mark the breviary and find the various parts of the choral office. In the refectory at supper, on the evening of his arrival, Francis had his first view of the assembled community, his first experience of Passionist life. As he took the lowest place at table, it would naturally fall to him as the latest arrived, he could not help reflecting upon the almost symbolic reversal of values. He, who had been first at Spoleto College, was now last in the monastery. It was a first and poignant lesson in humility. The meal was taken in silence. The bare wooden tables were devoid of tablecloths, but each individual was provided with a folded napkin. The spoons and forks were of wood, the crockery plain and simple. Though sufficient, the food made no concession to a dainty appetite. It was served by the novices, and as Francis glanced covertly at the close-cropped heads and serious young faces, he thought happily that soon he too would be one of them. At the end of the frugal meal, the rector rang a little bell, and all stood before the tables for the Thanksgiving prayers. Francis followed the long file of silent black-robed figures along a dimly lit corridor to visit the Blessed Sacrament. Finally, he arrived in the novices' recreation room, where permission was granted to all to speak. This was another object lesson, this time in obedience. In the novitiate, nothing may be done without permission. In his present mood, it was comforting for Francis to see a couple of familiar faces in the group that surrounded him. Two of his companions from Spoleto, Caesar Caladrandi and Pazzanio Gizamandi, had preceded him to the novitiate a week previously, having arrived together on September 3rd. They were both younger than Francis, but had been well known to him in Spoleto. Francis must have quietly enjoyed the look of amazement on their faces when they recognized the new postulant. They knew nothing of what had happened in the interval, and they must have asked themselves many questions. What was Francis Possenti doing amongst the Passionists? Why had the dancer come to Moravel? When the brief recreation came to an end, the novices rejoined the rest of the community for night prayers. As he knelt in the choir stalls, his rosary clasped in his hands, the familiar prayers sounding in his ears, Francis felt that he had at last come home. There was a great and wordless contentment in his heart, a deep peace in his soul. After the final blessing of the day, the slow, measured tones of the bell indicated the beginning of the great silence. Francis made his way quietly back to his bare little room. His first day in the monastery had come to a close. That night his deep slumber was disturbed by a strange noise. Never before had he heard anything remotely resembling it. For a moment he wondered wildly if it was the beginning of an earthquake. Then he relaxed and smiled at his fears. It was the noisy summons of the heavy wooden rattle calling the community to the night office of matins. As a new arrival, he had been dispensed from rising with the others, but in another day or two he too would respond to the summons. Lulled by the measured cadence of the distant chant, he soon fell asleep again. A new postulant is usually required to spend some time in spiritual exercises in the novitiate before receiving the religious habit. When Francis arrived, his 2 schoolfellows had already started their preparatory retreat and were due to receive the habit on September 14th. As Francis had arrived a week later, the date provisionally fixed for his reception of the habit was Sunday, September 21st, Feast of the 7 Dolores of Our Blessed Lady. For Francis, this was indeed a happy augury. In a meeting of the local chapter, the priests of the community considered the application of Francis Pasenti. He was called in to be questioned by the superior regarding his motives in joining the Passionists, and the vote, in favor of his admission, was unanimous. His paramount intention in entering religion was to give himself completely to God, and from the very start he was clearly very much in earnest. In quotes, "After a few days," said Father Norbert, "one would think he had been several months in the novitiate. His 2 companions, who had known him before he entered, were greatly edified by his conduct and often told me how surprised they were." End quote. Much to his surprise, Francis received a letter within a day or 2 after his arrival. It had been forwarded from home, and it was in fact the second letter of acceptance from the provincial in reply to his second urgent appeal. The directions given in the letter had already been complied with, but Francis felt much encouraged to read the cordial invitation from Mercanti. In quotes, "My dear Francis, I did not fail to reply immediately to your previous letter, and I do not know how my letter could have gone astray. Perhaps it was withheld by your father, who may have wished to test your vocation by not giving it to you. However, I am repeating my reply to the points raised in your letter. I hold that your resolution to become a religious is not the result of youthful thoughtlessness, but is a real and true vocation, which you must follow up with all diligence. Will you, therefore, proceed at once to our novitiate at Moraval, as there is a vacant place there? At least there should be, if it has not been allocated to someone else. The interview will take place in the novitiate, and will not be too exacting. I have already notified the Master of Novices about it. Kindly bring with you certificates of baptism and confirmation, certificates of being unmarried and being free from prosecution in any court, civil or ecclesiastical. Also, the sum of 28 scudi for your outfit. The above documents should all carry the seal of the Archiepiscopal Curia of your city. Pray for me, and believe me to be, firmly yours, in Deo Optimo Maximo, in Latin for, to the greatest and best God. Simon of St. Joseph, Passionist Provincial. It is quite clear that from the moment he set foot in the novitiate, Francis was radically changed. Father Norbert observed him closely and was more than satisfied. In quotes, during the spiritual exercises, he noted, he was seen to be most devout and attentive. His sentiments of piety showed the great importance he attached to the retreat. For him, the words of the apostle had a special urgency. In quotes, "The old things are passed away, behold, all things are made new." 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17. End quotes. Symbolic of the complete break with the past was the change of name, which always accompanied the taking of the habit. The Master of Novices had already announced that Caesar Caladrini would in future be known as Frater Philip of the Sorrowful Virgin, while as Pisani Gismondi would become Frater Hermenegild of the Sacred Heart. Francis eagerly awaited the moment when Father Raphael, the kindly Master of Novices, would tell him his new name. Whether Francis himself had any choice in the selection is not certain. Father Raphael may have asked him to indicate his preference, but he would certainly have left him free to choose a special devotion, the second part of his new title. In the event, Francis could hardly have chosen a name more in accord with his desires. He was to be called Gabriel of Our Lady of Sorrows. His new patron would be the angel of the Annunciation, who brought to Mary the tidings of the Incarnation. Gabriel would protect and guide him, bringing him close to his beloved Mother of Sorrows. At length, the day fixed for the simple ceremony was at hand, Sunday, September 21st, 1856. Early in the morning, when all the masses had been celebrated, the whole community gathered in the little church as Father Raphael prepared for the function. All eyes were fixed upon the slim, pale-faced youth, who knelt submissively before the altar with downcast eyes. As Francis listened attentively to the opening prayers, he felt that for him they seemed to have a special meaning, and he hoped a special efficacy. In quotes, "O omnipotent and eternal God, look kindly upon this thy servant Francis, who with his sincere mind wishes to follow thee alone in this place consecrated to thy glory, so that withdrawn from dangerous temptations he may walk in the path of thy commandments. Give unto him whom thou hast called from the vanities of the world the protection of thy help, so that no temptation may turn him from his purpose, through Christ our Lord. Amen." End quotes. After the blessing of the habit, the priest again prayed for Francis. In quotes, May the Lord divest thee of the old man of sin with his works, so that thou mayest put on Jesus Christ and him crucified." End quotes. Then Francis came forward to kneel before the celebrant and to receive his new insignia, the black habit, the leathern girdle, the long flowing mantle. Only the distinctive Passionist badge or sign was missing. That would not be bestowed until the taking of vows a year later. In memory of the Passion of Christ, a cross was placed upon his shoulder, and he was exhorted to carry it all his life with constancy and courage. After the ceremony, the community clustered around the new novice to offer their good wishes for success and to give him the kiss of peace. Later that evening, Gabriel sat in his cell and wrote to his father to give him the news. It was the first of many such letters, and it is clear and unaffected expression of his most intimate thoughts. He wrote, Marvelli, September 21st, 1856. My dearest father, the day has come at last. For a long time, Almighty God was waiting for me, but I ungratefully remained deaf to his call, enjoying myself and continuing to offend him in the world. But the infinite mercy of God wisely arranged all for my best. Today, the feast of Our Lady of Sorrows, our mother and patron, to my indescribable happiness, I was clothed in the religious habit, taking the name of Frater Gabriel of Our Lady of Sorrows. Up to the present minute, Father, I haven't had the slightest reason to be discontented either with the religious state or with my vocation. You may be quite sure that anyone called by God to the religious state receives a great and estimable favor, when insistent care is needed in the world to lead a good Christian life. Dearest Father, please forgive me for the many times I have been disobedient or have caused you trouble. Forgive me, too, if I sometimes gave away things belonging to the house or took them for myself. I also ask my brothers to forgive me, and also the housekeeper, if I have ever been unkind to her. Don't think I'm doing this for show or for any reason like that. Everything is weighed in the balance before God, and there should be no delay in making amends. Dear brothers, please be good and don't give our father any trouble, because he doesn't deserve it. Love one another. Dear Michael, avoid bad companions, for they can lead you to eternal ruin. I know the number of sins they can cause, and I'm only now beginning to realize how much we should value Father's good advice. Dear Henry and Vincent, I say the same thing to you. Do whatever Father tells you, and you'll have Mary's blessing. I don't intend to preach you a sermon. Indeed, I myself need one more than anyone. Pray for me, and get others to pray for me, and I'll do the same for you. Remember me to everybody, especially to the Jesuits and Oratorians. Asking your blessing, dearest Father, your most affectionate son, Frater Gabriel of Our Lady of Sorrows. P.S. Would you give the enclosures to Father Tedeschi and to the Hermit of Cessy? When he had finished his letter, Gabriel stood for a few minutes, lost in thought, as he gazed from his window across the quiet countryside, already veiled in the dusk of evening. Close at hand was the monastery garden, and beyond it lay the orchard and the meadows. Further still was the road upon which he had walked but a short 10 days ago. Tomorrow his letter would be on its way, back along the same road, back all the way to Spoleto. Already the old familiar life of Spoleto was fading from his memory. It had grown dim as the countryside before him had grown dim and would soon be lost in darkness. At this very moment, when the monastery was wrapped in silence for the night, Spoleto would be full of activity. Crowds would throng the foyer of the theater, where mirrors reflected myriad facets of light from heavy crystal chandeliers. In the fashionable drawing rooms, music and the light ripple of laughter would echo merrily behind drawn curtains and closed lattice shades. Outside in the dimly lighted streets, the rattle of carriage wheels and the clip-clop of horses would announce the coming and going of the most important guests. Would anyone spare a thought for him, he wondered wearily. And his father, his brothers, Pacifica, what were they doing now? The familiar routine of the home would continue unchanged. Only the arrival of his letter would cast a momentary flurry of excitement across its placid surface. Then, perhaps old Pacifica would go upstairs to his empty room and kneel before the Madonna's altar to breathe a prayer for him. It was less than 100 miles away, but as far as he was concerned, it was another world, another planet. He had stepped completely out of its orbit, and his life had arranged itself in an entirely new pattern. Almost involuntarily, he glanced down at his bare, sandaled feet, at the long black habit held in graceful folds by the leathered girdle. They were still a novelty to him, for they were as yet but a few hours old. But the change that had taken place was more than a change of name, a change of style, a change of dress. It was much more radical and complete. It was a change of personality. On that day, Francis Possenti had finally disappeared. Gabriel of Our Lady of Sorrows had taken his place.